Well, for people joining this live stream, this is a continuation of a discussion of a quite knotty subject of, well, things like when does an entity exist? It's about, in our new database integration framework, how should we deal with the notion of entities that are created on demand and so on. So let's take a look over here at what we're talking about. So what we had talked about previously, let's take a read of what this says, right? Entity extend. Okay, so this is adding for that entity class.
We were blocked where basically what entity list should do. And basically the question is what we should put as the first type in the first argument of the class. Should we put the whole query or should we try to make the query smaller?
Okay, can we just read what's here first, okay?
Sure.
So we have a hope. Okay, so here we're going from the entity class countries in the G8, which, as you've observed, could change its character as different countries enter and leave the G8.
Right, that was, yeah, that is part of the problem, yes.
Right, okay. And what this says, what entity extend says, I'm not completely certain it's the right name, is for this entity class, we are temporarily saying there is an additional property, effectively an additional column in the table that is called pop density and is computed like this from this entity class, where this X ranges over all the members of that entity class. Correct?
I would slightly phrase it different. I think sometimes entity classes can have their own properties that are not present in the properties because it's a collection of things. This extends the properties of the members of the entity class.
Okay.
It might be a small thing, but I think it matters.
No, it's important, yeah.
In the context of things that are backed by SQL, you should always have a guarantee that things are rectangular. So,
yeah, fine, but that's different.
I mean, some things
can be a separate table for an entity class or something. But in this case, what else can be in the first argument of entity extend other than an entity class?
A string, entity aggregate by, entity join across, entity select, entity sort by, anything. Any of the heads that we were discussing.
So it's anything that synthesizes a table, effectively.
Yes.
Right.
And this synthesizes a table by subcasing the full country entity table.
By filtering, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So then now we're saying that now we're selecting an entity class here. Oh, boy.
This is the filter. Yeah, this is the filter. So with that, we are just saying, we synthesize this population density, which is a function. Now we're saying adding in there is more than 5,000.
Yeah, but I don't understand. Why are we not going back to the entity class here and simply saying entity select on that entity class of...
Oh, yeah, we absolutely could. Yeah.
Okay, so this example isn't all that realistic because we wouldn't...
No, yeah, this is an example that's... What I wanted to show with this example is that there are two filters here. One is the name filter G8. The other is a filter that depends on an extension. And there is an algebraic way of stripping them off both. And, Riccardo and Tony are arguing that we should. Leonid and I are arguing that this might lead us into uncharted territory later. Because
okay, hold on. So are we seeing two alternatives here? If so, what are they?
The first alternative is that the outermost filters can be removed, whether they are entity take, entity sort by, entity class, or entity select. They are just...
This is the outermost one, as far as you're concerned. This one I've just highlighted. That's what.
Yeah, but even entity extend in this case, it doesn't really change things, and so you can. It actually commutes with the inside entity class. And so you could also remove the inner entity class and just get out basically something that is like Italy with just the extension method.
So wait. You're asking what should the result from this entity list be? Should it be a bunch of naked entities, or should it be something with a bunch of incrustation?
Exactly. And the answer is there are certainly some incrustation. We all agree that there are some incrustation that we can never remove. Leonid and I are saying, well, then let's not remove anything. That's the safest bet. And Riccardo and Tony are saying, but some things are obviously removable.
Okay, so wait a minute. So what we've agreed in the past is that entity value is the evaluator. It resolves things. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right.
Entity list is a sub-case of entity value.
Right. Well, we kind of agreed that entity list would also be a resolver. But the question is...
But of what? Yeah, that's the question.
Right. So the question is, are all other entity star functions lazy? Right? Because entity class could, in principle, unlazily just evaluate to a list of entities, but it doesn't. Entity class sits there lazily, so to speak, right?
Right. I mean, the only thing that evaluates is entity value, as far as I can think. I mean, there are also other constructs that are evaluated, but like common name and stuff. But
like what? Sorry.
With
entity value, or equivalently, the entity subvalue evaluates.
Well, there are a couple of other things like common name, canonical name.
Yeah, those kind of stuff.
Entity type name.
Okay, so wait a second. So, for example, in the case of common name, would you expect that common name implicitly calls entity value and is therefore a resolver of everything? I would think so.
I think that's maybe Tony can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. So common name is just an alias for retrieving the label property.
Fine. Okay. So, but it does an entity value, then it is like entity value of blah, comma label.
Yes.
Okay, let me ask another question. So let's imagine that you're going to plot one of these things. Okay, and you've got this big lazy creature lumbering along. But now you want to plot it. You clearly can't plot the lazy creature. Does plot implicitly call some kind of entity value thing to resolve it?
I can plot know which property to extract and which one are relevant to be plotted.
Fair enough. Okay, so your claim is, well, I mean, for example, feature space plot could, in principle, feature space plot could take, I mean, this may be exotic, okay?
No, but it's relevant, say, for geographics.
Explain. Oh, I see. You might have, go ahead.
You have some of these annotated creatures, but by the end of the day, there are countries inside, and countries are the only ones that we can de facto get some outlines and plot them in the geographics. And if we stick in this annotated, decorated, implicit entity class, we still want to see probably a picture. So somebody has to do the work and resolve it.
Right. Well, okay. So that's a question of, is there implicit resolution in addition to explicit entity value style resolution, right? And what are the cases where we need implicit resolution? In other words, if you see one of these things, you either error out, or is there, and that's the question. So the most generic form of entity value, I claim, is entity list.
No, it's quite the contrary.
No, but what I mean by that is, if you're given some, giant lazy creature, right, and you feed it into GeoList plot, then what could GeoList plot do? Well, it doesn't know what entity value to extract.
But it's not done, because GeoList plot in the end, even if you give it an entity list,
will be the same problem.
Polygon or something like that. So
well, I know, but it knows. Okay, fine, fair enough. It knows that given an entity, it implicitly goes and looks up the polygon of that entity.
Yeah. So the final thing actually doesn't need to go through entity list at all, and I hope it doesn't. So imagine you build up your own entity store with your administrative divisions of Liechtenstein, and you just want to create a polygon once. You don't want to do it in 2 steps.
Well, okay. So
Yeah, but I also don't see how it would help, Stephen. I mean, every property that you got on the single entity are also properties of the class. So, I mean,
right. Okay, but I just want to be clear. I'm trying to find examples. I mean, what you're basically saying is, entity value is, in a first approximation, the only resolver, right?
Yeah, everything else can be built on top of that. Yes.
Well, but what is the everything else?
Common name.
Resolver. Okay, so that then, except with special cases like common name and question mark entity list is a special case of entity value. Is that true?
It is.
What is what is the version of entity value which is entity list?
Entities, second argument entities.
No, actually, entities is a special property. More correctly, it would be canonical name, and you can guess the type from the input entities. So canonical name, if that is considered a property, then entity value can be used to resolve that.
I don't understand. I mean, what I'm asking is, if I look at, what is the identity? If I look at entity list of foo, right? By the way, I'm generating, in this version, I am generating a weird self-test error that just popped up here. That when I typed that entity list, it must be an autocomplete self-test error. Let me show it to you. Somebody should take a picture of that, please, Dominic or somebody. Got it?
Sure.
Okay, that happened when I typed entity list. You should feed that to the user assistance folk. It's a bug in whatever I'm using here. I don't know what version I'm using.
Okay.
Let's find out. Oh, that's really strange. That's really strange. Okay, so you should. Okay, so that happened when I typed entity list for some reason. As I say, I would strongly suspect that. Yeah. Oh wow, that is a repeatable bug. Oh, look what it says. Look what it says. It says try file missing from layout. Okay, so let me just, I'll send this in. Sigh. That's actually a high priority and nasty bug.
So you're sending that out?
I guess I will.
Okay.
I don't really, it needs to be done now, so. Okay. Send it to a tracking system. Okay. Okay, in any case, so tell me, what is entity list of foo equivalent to?
So it would be entity of entity type name of foo. So just a basic version, comma, comma, hash, closing square bracket, and.
Oh, sorry, it's the hash what?
Hash and then closing square bracket, ampersand. And then you map over entity value of foo, comma, canonical name. So that would be a basic version of entity list.
Modulo what does entity type name do?
Yes.
Which is the whole discussion, I guess.
Yes, so we are wondering how to extend that now.
Well, entity type name if it isn't, if it is a pop-up entity, so to speak, it's not clear what that should be.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. All right. So let's go back here. All right. So what's the, okay, so we're agreeing entity value and somewhat entity list is the only resolver. So everything else is lazy. It's a little bit unfortunate that, again, anything that's lazy should be a noun. Unfortunately, entity value is also a noun, but entity extend shouldn't be that. As I've said before, it should be entity extension if it's anything. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I mean, again, my point is, which doesn't really work for entity extend or extension, is that for many others, there is like a very clear correspondence with the nigger operator, like select. And
yeah, I don't care. It should be selection if it's lazy.
Yeah,
select is not entity aggregation by. If it's lazy.
What about joining? What is that? Like,
well, I don't know. What is that? Yeah, I mean, that's okay. We need noun forms for these things. By the way, somebody's making a weird background noise. These I'm adding to. Okay, so let's keep going over here. So what is there an alternative that's being presented? Or what are you suggesting here?
So one alternative is to strip certain things, like if you have filters on the top level before aggregation, or if you have
what do you mean by strip? Do you mean make them non-lazy?
No, I mean like removing them from the output type that is returned for the entity as the first argument.
Like think about the current example of two entity list on entity country G8. You get entities with country as the first argument. You lose the fact that they came from G8.
Yes, I understand that.
That's the whole discussion is whether entity list tries to resolve filters and remove them.
Okay, so listen, look. Entity value and entity list are resolvers. They should resolve whatever they can resolve, because in the end, they've got to get an answer. I mean, it reminds me of the, somehow I'm reminded of the quixotic adventures of things like Haskell at some moment in its life, when the thing was so pure and lazy that it never actually gave an answer, right? In the end, we've got to actually get an answer. And we've got to have functions that get an answer. And when they get an answer, they should strip everything they can strip, because they're trying to just get an answer. Now, we may have other functions that don't do that, but we need some function that just goes and gets an answer.
But there is a problem with this, Stephen. And the problem is that part of the answer remains lazy, meaning that entities themselves are lazy references. And it returns a list of those things.
Okay, so wait a second. So you're saying, okay, so case one, most operations, quotes, stay lazy. Okay, except for the resolvers. Okay, so now your issue is what happens when you think you're using a resolver, but you can't actually resolve all the way.
Yes, and then the question is, what do we resolve and what we don't?
Okay, what happens if you think you're using a resolver, but full resolution isn't possible? Okay, now let's discuss
full resolution mean.
Full resolution, okay, so what I mean by full resolution is it is computing, okay, so resolution, the claim would be, resolution is compute to return non-entity constructs e.g. quantities, or base. I'm going to make a claim here that may not be correct, okay? Or essentially, or resolved functions of base entities. What is a base entity? Base entities can include non-pop-up entities from external sources. That would be my claim for what resolution means.
Yeah, full resolution, we all agree, I think, that is completely impossible. And if you look at the two examples above, you have to keep entity extend because otherwise you cannot compute properties. And you need to compute aggregation because that changes like the algebra of what you're looking at. So basically, in the second example, these things behave like Europe, like continents. They don't behave like countries anymore. So you can't resolve that. So in a certain sense, there are many cases where you cannot fully resolve.
Sorry, could you say that again? I got distracted here.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that you, for example, you cannot remove extensions because otherwise you cannot access properties anymore. And if you're doing something like that changes the algebra, like aggregation or joins, you cannot remove that because, like, if you look at the second example, those guys behave like continents. They don't behave like countries anymore. And so you can't remove aggregate by. So again, full resolution is impossible. You can do partial resolution.
Okay, but so hold on. What gets an answer? What are you going to do with this thing that you got here?
For example, you can request certain properties from it, the values.
Okay. So that's a resolution. That's the final resolution. So this thing is unresolved. What are we doing?
It's partly resolved. Sorry, Stephen, to interrupt, but it's partly resolved.
Okay, so wait a second. So what is the operator that causes partial resolution? Is it entity list or what?
It is the entity list, yes.
Okay, so the claim would be, okay, so can you have an entity value that is not fully resolved?
No.
Okay, let's go through this.
Well, no, you can.
Actually, you can if it returns entities.
Because some properties might be entity valued. So you can ask what is, you take Italy and you ask for the capital city that returns a reference to Rome. That's not fully resolved.
Well, wait a second. What does that mean? We said full resolution can return either non-entity constructs or resolved functions of base entities, like a list of cities or something.
Okay, then there is another example where it can happen, Stephen. If you are doing entity list of an aggregation, then you resolve to entities which are aggregate, so they're composite. They are not base entities. So
just a second.
Sure.
Could you go ahead again, please?
Yeah. So imagine you're doing entity list of the aggregate by of country over continent.
Aggregate by
of country.
Oh, I see it here, right.
Yeah, and in that case, you will return entities which are not base entities.
And they still might depend on some inner
but listen. You're confusing yourself again, okay? This is entity list doing its work again, right?
Yeah. But it's a special case of entity values, so you can also ask entity values.
No. But what you're saying is, okay, so what I'm saying is something has to actually resolve the thing, right? And you're saying that you can be in a situation where it never resolves, where what's returned is a bunch of pop-up entities.
Yes.
No, yeah, the thing is that entity list is a partial resolver. By definition, when you have pop-up entities.
Okay, hold on. The first question is entity value always a full resolver?
No.
Okay, so let's understand. Okay, what is partial resolution?
But why not? Why not? Why did you say that entity value is not always a full resolver?
Well, I think
Oh, you
the
mean
line full resolver. I mean, if it's returning an entity, is that full resolution?
No. Read the definition. Read the definition here. Okay. Resolution: compute to return non-entity constructs or resolved functions of base entities. Am I making sense?
yeah? But if you only list their base entities, then
No. That's the definition. That's the definition I want to make of resolution.
Okay.
I'm not clear as to what resolve function means there in that context.
Okay, resolved
What is the
functions
function of
means,
entities?
okay. Built-in functions, let's say that. Built-in functions are base entities. Okay,
Well,
so
if
things
entity
like
aggregate
lists.
by is a built-in function.
I'm sorry, what?
Is entity aggregate by going to be
non-entity related built-in functions. Okay, so things like list or squared or plus or whatever else. See what I'm saying?
What about entity class? Because one thing we're thinking is that
I think not. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm asking here. So this is a straw definition for full resolution, and it says that that's not.
Okay, no, because we were thinking of some cases where it might be useful to return entity class from entity value, but let's not get into that now because I think it's a distraction.
I'm sorry. What is a distraction?
Okay, so in some cases, like for example, you imagine when you look at notable books by Stephen Wolfram, we currently return a list of 2 entities, but it might sometimes be useful to return basically the inverted entity class of book type. So say instead of, what are the notable books by Stephen Wolfram? The answer is entity class book, author goes to Stephen Wolfram. Sometimes it might be useful to keep it that way, but especially if you're going to chain them and ask for like publication dates of those books. It's more efficient if it's not a list.
Well, it may be more efficient, but I'm asking the question. Okay.
Let's say for now, yes. For now, yes. As things stands now, the answer is entity value always resolves.
But what about entity value acting on these pop-up entities and returning some of them back? As for example, entity property association.
Yeah, sure. With entity property association, but that's in the keys. So maybe you should not worry about that by the central dogma of association.
Okay, so you only restricted to argument entity value.
Also, that's a modifier.
Okay.
Wait a second. So let's ask the question then. What does partial resolution? So full resolution, do we agree on the definition of full resolution?
Well, we can't agree or disagree. You just made the definition, so we accept it as a definition.
Okay, fine. Okay.
It's a definition.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Okay, so do we then agree that entity value always causes full resolution?
Yeah.
Probably. I can't think right now of counterexample, but
okay. All right. So then we can write down entity value. Oh, what did I just do here? Wow. Weird. Okay. Entity value. Oops. Causes full resolution. Entity list, however, may not cause full resolution. We don't yet know. That's a big question mark.
I think we know.
And the
full resolution is impossible.
It might be.
But you've also claimed that entity list is a special case of entity value, so you can't have it all ways.
But the real problem is the entity type name part, not the entity value.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. And then we've also got entity type name, which is a weird concept. That's where are we here? Okay, so partial resolution. What does that mean? That means that you are getting back essentially these lazy entity constructs. Is that right? Well,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there an argument? Is there a discussion? Those lazy constructs do absolutely nothing. They just sit there, right?
Yes.
And they sit there until entity value is called.
Well, but this time on them separately.
No, what does that mean? I don't understand what you mean by that. There is an object that's some kind of giant encrusted entity aggregate by, entity select, whatever. And
yeah, so that's runtime type of that entity.
I guess, Stephen, I guess that the question is, do we want partial resolution? Because in some cases, we can safely say, take entity class country G8. Well, you can strip the fact that it was coming from G8 and just return Italy. But then if you're like aggregating the countries of G8 by continent, you cannot strip the fact that they were coming from G8 anymore. And so when, Egypt enters G8, then you have a new entity that is Africa, because it's the continent of Egypt. And that thing exists or doesn't exist depending on the belonging to G8.
Okay,
so,
but wait a second. If the resolver has run, there is no more lazy stuff anymore. In other words, it's just like if I do the following. If I say now, today, if I say day of week, what is it called? Day of week? Is that what it's called? What is it called? Well, anyway, if I say date value of today, comma, day of week, is that what it's called? Why is that not? Well, not autocomplete?
Yeah, that's full resolution. And that's what
can
you
somebody
can
report the fact that date value is not autocompleting its second argument? And that's another bug there. Okay, I didn't hear anybody say yes, so I'll do it myself.
We'll do it, Stephen.
No, I'm doing it now. Also, the pop-up there had the wrong font. I reported that as well. Okay. Whatever. You get the point that you can say,
yeah.
Okay, that you can, obviously that resolves, right? But it would resolve to something different, in a month, right?
Yes.
Okay, so similarly here, there are things like entity value that will just resolve, and whatever they resolve to is what they resolve to now. If you run them again on the same raw expression, they may resolve to something different in the future. Am I making sense?
Right.
Yeah, but entity list, unfortunately, is like...
Okay. Entity list is a weird intermediate case. I'm just trying to understand, entity value, how is that working? Do you get what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, apart from entity value, in a first approximation, ignoring entity list, ignoring entity type name, apart from entity value, everything stays unevaluated. Is that a true statement? So, in other words, the functions, do you have a list of them somewhere? Entity select, entity aggregate, aggregation, entity selection. I think it should be entity aggregation by. I think it is way too confusing to have them not be nouns. Do you get what I'm saying?
Fine. Just tell me what the noun for join is.
I don't know. Entity join.
When you join two things, you get a mongrel. Entity mongrel?
Entity joining or something. I don't know. That's not a very good name. Okay, that's a separate issue. Let's look at those together. Okay, but this is, I think if there is no non-lazy form of these functions, now, if they're inside a wrapper that makes them lazy, and if there is an eager immediate form of them, then certainly it can be entity select, if it is kept lazy by something else. But you're saying that entity selection on its own is already lazy. It's born lazy, so to speak. Is that correct?
Yes.
It is not made lazy by being inside a function or some such other thing. Correct?
Yes, it's completely inert by itself.
Okay. So then what you're saying is, okay, so entity value, could entity value return entities that contain laziness?
Well, in some sense, all entities to some extent contain laziness. Even
Okay,
the base one.
Right, okay, but so look at our definition of resolution here. Non-entity related built-in functions are base entities, where base entities can include non-pop-up entities from external sources.
Yes,
so what I mean by that is it can be entity of source, comma, name, but it cannot be some deeply encrusted implicit form. So do we believe that it is possible for entity value to resolve down to non-entity functions of things like this? Or are there irreducible pieces of sort of lazy entity functionness that have to...
Well, there is one exception, which is basically if you put something weird in the data of your entity, and that thing is like an entity-related function with some stuff in it, then you're out of luck. But on the other hand, entity value should evaluate to the things that you put. Say, if you have in-memory entities.
Okay,
whatever
so hold on. Does entity value? Let's say that the return value of an entity store is an encrusted lazy entity construct. You know what I'm saying?
Return value of what?
The return value of an entity store, the property of an entity in an entity store, right? Let's imagine that that is an encrusted object, okay? That the thing you put in there was just an entity aggregation by blah, 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 right? That is the value that's returned.
Okay.
So it's as if, so that thing might be in the entity store, right? That would be a thing where you say, whatever it is, property, blah, 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 arrow value here. But that arrow value is an encrusted, lazy entity construct. Get what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, now you are in the process of extracting. You extract that value. Oh, I see. I see. So, yeah, okay, so that value, oh boy,
will not be resolved. I don't think you should resolve the value because you might end up in a regression error or...
Okay, but hold on. This case where it's colon greater than an entity value, that will resolve fine. But the other case, there's nothing to resolve because if it didn't resolve here, then it's not going to resolve. You see what I'm saying? Then there isn't enough information to resolve it. There's no entity value to resolve it. It's just some, random floating, unevaluated entity construct. Make sense?
Yeah. Yes. So that gives a counterexample to the statement that everything resolves.
It means the definition has to be more nuanced, yes.
Yeah, but you can say basically that you end up having something which is functions of the values you put in.
Everything, hold on, everything that, but what does put in mean? Because there's different layers of put inness, right? So I think what it is there is, and there's also different levels of entity valueness. I suspect that entity value peels down a certain level of entity function encrustation, so to speak. But I don't know what's the peel down.
But it isn't just resolving the properties, whatever the computation of the property are returning.
Yes, but my point here is it the case? So we've given an example here where entity value does not resolve all the way. You see what I'm saying?
Well, it does. I mean, in a sense, it's if you think about entity value like function application is returning the result of applying an entity function. That's it. If the entity function is returning, again, entity construct,
right, so you may be right. Okay, so fine. So the awkward case is entity type name, aka entity list. Right? So entity type name is of this encrusted composite entity, tell me what is the type of entity that this is, right? And the answer, the question is, does that in any way resolve? I don't think it can.
And that's what we also think was Carlo.
Okay, so hold on. So what would entity type name? I mean, it's a very weird. What does entity type do? Entity type means that actual entity type. Is that right? No, there is no entity type. It's just entity type name. That's interesting.
Well, in a way, there is entity type, Stephen. That's the first argument of entity.
But Stephen, I think that for me, there are two possibilities of simplification. There is and I think that there is a version of this in the code of the entity framework. There is one version of entity type name that recurses, and in the end tells me, okay, these are all the base types involved. This can be can contain city, country, and person. And it can return a list of things because not necessarily one table is involved in the operation. And there is another thing that doesn't resolve anything.
I
I don't believe.
Are you saying that's what entity type name does today? Or you're saying that's what entity type name could do?
The entity type name right now doesn't really say anything. I mean, right now, if you pass it.
Yeah, right now it's just an extractor for the first element of entity.
Yeah. But if you pass it an entity class, it will remove the filter. On the other hand, I would say that entity type name of entity class returns entity class.
Okay, so hold on. So if I say entity class of country, comma G8. Why is that not auto-completing? I don't know. That's weird. That's probably not correct. Well, the question is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly the question.
Okay.
And in general, Carl and myself think that in general it's wrong. And so we should keep the original construct, whatever it is, as a type.
So entity type name is identity, basically?
No, because entity type name, listen, when you're at a base entity, right? If I do this, whose country should we pick? Let's do that, okay? When you're at a base entity, it is a trivial extractor of the first argument of entity. The question is, what does it do when that thing there is not an entity class, but is some kind of, entity selection?
Well, in the end, entity class and entity select are the same thing, if you think about it. Entity selection. You could say, you can write that entity class as, membership equals G8 or something.
Yeah, but a filter isn't really changing the type, is it? And a sorting operation isn't really changing the type. A take operation is not really changing the type. An operation that changes the type is aggregation. That is changing the type.
That depends on what definition of the type, Ricardo.
Yes, yeah, it sure depends.
Also, another thing that effectively changes the type is entity extension.
Absolutely.
Entity extension for sure, entity join for sure. But we can argue that the filter and sorting and other operation are not really changing the type.
But you say that entity selection at its base always operates on entity classes. Is that true? Doesn't operate directly on an entity. Can it operate on an entity type?
Well, I would say it operates on the classes, yes.
Okay, but what happens if I want to do a selection from all countries? How do I do that?
Well, if you can just use the string country, which is an alias for the class of all countries.
I see. So that's an alias for entity class of country, comma, all or something.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So entity extension is an example of something which isn't going to. So the entity type name of an entity extension better not get rid of the entity extension because it's actually changed it's effectively a pop-up type, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. And so we can't remove it.
Yes, but what we try to argue with Carlo is that also even for cases which seem to be removable, we better not do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it should be very well defined whether you remove or you don't remove. And my claim is that only entity value removes. So now the question is, what should entity list do? Should entity list remove as much as it can, or should it not? My guess is that what should happen is that entity list, and this is probably where we started actually, that entity list should remove as much as it can. That's its best, most courteous operation.
Right.
Okay, so my claim would be that the only things that remove anything are entity value and entity list. An entity type name, I would say entity type name should simply fail for anything that isn't a very plain Jane entity.
But then so should entity
not
list.
useful.
I'm sorry?
But then so should entity list if it's built of entity type name.
No. I'm saying entity list is not the definition you gave for entity list before in terms of entity type name would no longer be preserved. That entity, okay, so let's go through it. Entity value does full resolution, okay? Every other entity operation doesn't do any resolution at all. Footnote, except for common name and some things like that that are basically the same, that are aliases for an entity value, okay? Okay. Then the claim is that the intermediate case that we're still flapping around about is entity list, okay? Entity type name just fails unless it's eating an entity with a very obviously exposed type.
An alternative would be that entity type name simply returns back the complex type it encounters.
That's probably possible too. Now, does it always have an obvious type? I mean, an entity extension.
But I mean, if we, Stephen, in my view, if we decide, I mean, it's not clear yet if we are going to the road where, we strip out stuff or we don't. But if we do strip out things from entity list, then the same kind of resolution should happen in entity type name to me.
Okay, because but let's look at, okay, so entity type name of an entity class. Should that strip? I don't even understand. What is the type of an entity aggregation by?
It's just that thing, entity aggregation by.
But why is that the type? That's the full thing itself.
Yes, and that's what
type.
So there's an example that made me understand that question actually.
Okay.
And it was, let's say you start, or a user starts with an entity store that has just some cities, but he doesn't have countries. But the city entities in his entity store have a property called country, which gives maybe some string country names or whatever.
Yep.
Then the user can group his cities by country.
Yep.
And then he needs a handle to these country virtual types. And that's why we can't get rid of this group by country construct.
I understand that. The point that I'm making is, it's one thing to have an entity class full of actual entities, right? But I claim that the type of that sure isn't the thing itself. You see what I'm saying?
But why?
No, because just like the entity type name of the entity Italy isn't the entity Italy, it's country.
Yes, Stephen, but then you're confusing the first and second argument of entity. What we are talking about is the first argument, which is.
I know we're talking about that, but I'm saying that in this entity aggregate by, the thing you have there, if I'm understanding correctly, is the full answer. It's not just the first argument of entity, right? Entity aggregation by is, well, let's take entity selection, okay? Entity selection of an entity class is a new entity class, right? It is the full entity class, full of entities, full of countries, full of various forms of life, whatever it is, okay?
Yes.
It is not the type of that. The type of that is a different thing. See what
Why?
I'm saying?
But why?
No. Listen. The integer 17 is the integer 17. It is not the type integer, right?
Yes, but it's a different example, Stephen. Because here you have a lazy construct, which, like you say, when you say that entity selection is a full answer full of entities, but because it's lazy, it's at the same time also a type.
No, it's an answer. The type of it is entity type of that. Another lazy thing. It's perfectly possible to say that you say, what's the entity type of it? Okay, it's entity type of that, which is itself lazy.
I was kind of pointing out the same thing long ago and was exactly on your position. But then Carlo convinced me that you don't really have a difference between...
It's not right. It's not right. There's two levels. I mean, this is
Stephen, it's really, I mean, you can decide what, like, think about, I don't know, integers. You take all the integers, and then you select only the even ones.
Yes.
I mean, are they the same type or not?
No. Wrong analogy. The result of the select is the set of even integers. Okay. This is what old Bertrand Russell, when he originally invented the stupid idea of types. Okay. He did it in order to avoid this, the set of all sets and so on. Right. He did it in order to have another level that isn't the set itself. Do you get what I'm saying? And that's what we need to do as well. In other words, there's a difference between the thing, the set, whatever, and the type of the set.
You mean the Barber's paradox?
Yes, something like that.
But yes. The real problem is that in relational algebra, there isn't really a difference.
Well,
and that's
tough luck.
And then it becomes even more complicated because SQL doesn't really implement relational algebra. And so things are not sets.
Okay, fine. Okay, that's as maybe. But for our purposes of unscrambling this and being able to generalize it, we do need to recognize that a thing is not the same as the type of a thing. Okay, so
one question I would have to you, Stephen, is because this thing is lazy, isn't that at the same time a set and the type?
No. Of the thing you get out is a set, right? You can perfectly well ask, what is the type of that set, right?
But that set has not been materialized.
What's that?
That set, which is a result, has not been materialized in any way.
Magnificent. I agree. Okay. Nor will this entity type be realized. This will also stay lazily unevaluated. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, we certainly can introduce this quantity, no question about it.
Right. So then that becomes an entity type name. My proposal would be entity type name simply fails unless it's given a bare base entity. Okay?
But why can't it return?
It just fails.
Why cannot it return this entity type?
Oh, it could. Yes, it could return the entity type thing. It could do that. It's a little weird, but
then what? I mean, okay, then we have.
Okay, it doesn't matter. But that's I think that's a corner case. I would be happy to have it fail if it doesn't given a base entity type name, that is. But entity type should remain. Entity type there should, I claim, remain unevaluated if given an entity structure inside. Okay, and then the question would be, what causes entity type to, and then once you have that entity type, among other things, you can feed it in as a type of an entity here, if you want to.
Yeah, that's what we are currently sort of doing with the naked internals of that.
Right, but I'm saying that, and maybe as a courtesy, we can support that, but this is the full form of it. That it is the entity type of that, and there's an algebra of what we can do with the type. And so, for example, if we had entity type there, and then at some point we say common name of that, for example, common name is a resolver. And so if that's resolvable, which it may not be, that would resolve it.
No, but the common name of an entity type should come out with a property.
because it's not an entity. It cannot really,
No, okay, fair enough. It comes out with, but okay, but let's go back to what entity. So this is my claim that entity type needs to exist. It's the symbolic representation of the type of a potentially composite, potentially lazy entity structure. Okay. Okay.
Well, that was my suggestion a year ago, but then somehow I got convinced that.
Okay, well, let's keep going for a second. Okay.
Okay.
Now there's entity list. Okay. So entity value, again, is a resolver, so it tries to resolve anything. Entity list, what does it do? Right? What is the most convenient thing for entity list to do? It certainly, we have certain end cases. One end case is if you can resolve, entity list should resolve. If you cannot resolve, do you do partial resolution? I would say probably yes. So in other words, if it can resolve, all's good. You just, you just resolve to a list.
And so by partial resolution, you would mean that it will obviously resolve primary keys for the entities, and also it will try to resolve the type to the more simpler form of that type.
That's what I think. I consider this a little bit heuristic, what it's going to do. But I mean, we have to have a definition. It's not certain. I'm not certain exactly what it should do.
But Stephen, I mean, we can have a heuristic. What I'm not willing to predict right now is what the shape of the heuristic is going to be as we have more features.
That's fine.
And that's why I think.
But Carlo,
that just like we did for Entity Store, the safest bet right now is to not try to be overly smart. Because I have a feeling that it's going to bite us back when we try to support things like window functions and advanced.
Fine. But so my guess is that entity list failing to resolve or even giving errors is okay. I think that if entity list doesn't give a list, it possibly should give an error. See what I'm saying? For now. Because it's much easier to back out of giving an error than it is to back out of giving a result that we don't think is the right result. If it gives an error, nobody can build on it. Am I making sense?
Okay.
No, they actually can, because they can expect that error to come and
whatever. Okay, they can do. Okay, people can build on sand. If you give them a whatever. But okay. So what I'm suggesting is that the policy should be entity list is basically merely a sort of heuristic endpoint. It is not the thing you use to build up serious programmatic stuff. What you build for serious programmatic stuff is you use entity value as the resolver, use entity selection, entity aggregation by, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those constructors, those are the things you really use. And in a sense, all those constructors merely are a setup to do things. I mean, it is pretty unfortunate, and it will be hard for debugging, right? That what you'll end up with is a giant encrusted creature that doesn't evaluate. Then you hit it with entity value, and then it'll evaluate everything, right? Now, the reason that's a problem is, in the usual infinite evaluation model of symbolic computation that we have, the one nice feature is that you get to incrementally do things and you get to see what happened, right? Whereas what you're proposing here is something where nothing happens until everything happens, so to speak. Now,
you know what? I think I actually like this conclusion, because, I mean, to me, and I would, like, if I could decide, I would really like to just deprecate entity list. And so if what you're saying is that basically if entity type name cannot resolve to a base type, then entity list fails, then I'm totally fine with that. Because it means that as soon as you have a more complex example, you just stop relying on entity list.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, it's the closest we have to deprecating entity list.
Fine. I think that's okay as a working hypothesis, but I want to just work through the thing I just said. Okay, this problem with debugging. Did you understand what I was saying? So in other words, right now, the way this is set up, it's like you build everything. You build this giant castle in the sky, and then suddenly you press entity value, and the castle suddenly resolves and jumps into life and produces flying dragons or whatever it's supposed to do. But the problem is, as you're building the castle, you have no idea what's going on.
Actually, I'm working a lot with operator composition when I write programs. I don't run into that issue because I keep adding an operator after another while doing evaluations again and again.
I see what you're saying. Okay. So you're saying your style of programming, which, now remember, in this case, what is the resolver for what you're doing, Tony? This is in the Sparkle stuff or what?
Sparkle, but also general programming. So I rather keep composing operators and at the end apply it to something or even pass the operator around. But I can still rerun the program after each adding new operator.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. I mean, okay, fine. All right, look, I think we have some kind of conclusion here. Happy with this? If so, let's call it a day. We didn't have any response on the live stream.
Sounds reasonable.
Complicated. This was a seriously complicated discussion. So I hope people who are listening to this got something out of it. It's a little bit abstract. But okay, fair enough. Great. All right. So let's so the next thing we have to do on this database stuff, I suppose, is let's try and get all the functions renamed in a reasonable way.
Also, Stephen, to remind, we probably should just once again finalize the naming of single entity, because I think we already discussed that, but I'm not sure if we...
What is single entity? What do you mean?
I mean, the second argument that we are using here, entity ID, you see above in this example, entity ID of association. Did we completely agree on this form? I hope yes, but just to remind.
What is
like
that
if you look, if you look at this example here,
yeah,
there is entity ID of association.
Yes.
And so this is how we would like to see things, but we just need
to see what is that? I'm sorry, what is that again?
That's the canonical name of this entity.
But that entity list will fail on that.
Sure.
Because it doesn't resolve to a string name.
Yeah.
So I was saying that now all this business with the complicated entity IDs is no longer relevant because we never get single entities of complicated types out.
But
that's what we're saying, yeah. Because entity list was our only way of getting those.
Well, not exactly the only way, because there are other things like entity association or entity.
Like you can do it with the third argument of entity value also.
Well, okay, so the question is, listen, guys. We either have to have a way of making, okay, so the thing you've invented there with entity ID is a resolution of that which cannot be resolved, so to speak.
Yes, in a way, if we are now effectively deprecating entity list on complex types, then yes.
No, but we still need entity ID for composite primary keys in any case.
But why, if you never get single entities of that type out?
Because if you have in a database a table with multiple primary keys,
well, then you can just make them into a list. It's not that there's never going to be any confusion.
Yeah, that's. I mean, at least
don't need this entity ID thing because we are not resolving into. I mean, in a sense, entity ID is a bizarre creature that basically stores all of its history. It packs all its history in some weird corner because it doesn't want to admit that it's just not evaluated, actually. And I think we don't need it. From the, in the discussion we're having right now, we don't need it. So just to be clear, sorry, what I'd like to do, by the way, this entity join thing, the word join as a database join word is a pretty obscure word. And we have another thing that means join. So maybe this is a wake-up call for us to call that something different, like entity combination or some such other thing. I don't know what the right name for it is. But let's try to use this as an excuse to not have to, continue the kind of confusion of database joining, which is a really weird name. Fair enough. So, but let's come back next time, preferably soon, and go through what all of the functions with their noun forms actually are and how they work. And I think we've now got a way to think about them where basically they don't resolve until you entity value them. Make sense?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Talk to you all soon. Thanks. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.